Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah, alhamdulillah. This is part 4 on this brief discussion on Islam versus capitalism, Islam versus libertarianism. I had mentioned in an earlier session that capitalism has tried, for centuries to maintain a mythology, because they don't want people understanding how the system began and how it actually works, There's the myth that most people believe, and it's wrong, that capitalism just naturally occurred. It was a natural evolution of things. Professor Karl Polanyi was a Holocaust survivor. Most of his family was wiped out. And he was a scholar of political economy and social studies, right? He published a book in 1945 called The Great Transformation, because after having seen what fascism had done, and I've talked about this, that fascism was a great terror. I mean, it was the greatest terror that humanity has ever seen. And by the end of World War II, over 50 million human beings had lost their lives, trying to stop fascism. So, of course, because millions of his people were killed, he wanted to understand, how did this happen? How did society produce this monstrosity, And he looked at the foundations of society, and that means looking at economy. And he looked at the condition that Germany was in after World War II, and it prompted him to believe that it was economic conditions that produced fascism that killed his people and 50 million people on Earth, He marks the beginning of modern capitalism with the Enclosure Acts, And I think he's right, so let me explain what it is. Prior to the Enclosure Acts, and this goes back all the way through Islamic history, human beings always had a frontier, You had towns and villages, and outside of those, if you were someone who didn't like that life or couldn't afford living there, you had the option of going out beyond the perimeter, In other words, land was free, People didn't own every spot of land, And in England and actually throughout Europe, these free lands were called the commons, It meant it was the common land of the people. And this was actually enshrined in a sister document to the Magna Carta that spelled out the rights that people had in using that land and its resources, The Enclosure Acts put an end to that. And that's why Karl Polanyi called that the Great Transformation. It literally changed life on Earth, And libertarians should pay attention to this, So what happened? With the Enclosure Acts, just think about the meaning of enclosure. they took all the free lands, and this began in England and France, okay, and you're talking about 200 to slightly over 300 years ago, okay, and it was a series of acts, and it took all of the lands, or most of them, and drew lines on a map, okay, and allocated them as private property, okay, to be owned by certain people. And other people, the people who had been living there for generations and generations, for thousands of years, suddenly lost their rights. They could not live there. Okay, so the majority of those people then were forced off of this land, and you began the massive influx of people into urban centers, big cities, okay? Now, this made several huge changes, and I just mentioned one of them. That the people were no longer free to take your family, your tribe, your community out to the countryside, build huts and houses, farm the land, hunt the animals, raise cattle. That freedom was taken away. All right? Well, that's a huge change in life. It forced urbanization, and the people moving into these towns and cities then were jobless. They had no means of living. They had used to farm the lands, okay? So you have then mass poverty in these cities, ghettos, slums, okay? And this period, you'll find it in the writings of Charles Dickens, okay? Even though his writings are fictional, but the settings of almost all of his books is in poverty. It's all very dreary, okay? Look at A Christmas Carol, look at, I've forgotten the names of his Dickens books, but go look at them. They're very gloomy, very dreary. And that was the environment that was created after the Enclosure Acts. So then what? It forced them to look for jobs for wages, okay? That's very different, okay? And they were forced to. They had to take the jobs. This is a key element in understanding one of the major problems of capitalism, okay? Now, there's a verse in the Quran, there's several verses in the Quran, but one of them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be asking people, Yawm al-Qiyamah, what condition were you in? Because people are trying to make excuses for their bad behavior. And they will say, oh Allah, we were oppressed. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answers, the angels answer, okay, wasn't the earth big enough? Wasn't there enough space for you to go out away from this oppression? And you could go find a place and live out there and, you won't be corrupted. Well, that used to be true. I looked up what the world population was in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The entire world population is estimated to have been around 200 million people. Okay? Now we're up over 7.5 billion. Okay? We're approaching 40 times the population. That's places for people to live, demand on lumber, demand on food. And so even if we believed in, freer rights, okay, for business owners, etc., just the fact that the world has been gobbled up by this huge population, that itself, it implies that there would be a new ijtihad, an effort to understand the impact on humanity, okay? Because you're in a condition where world population itself is putting a strain on things, but then capitalism is extremely destructive, okay? Because they don't follow any rules, all right? Now, the Enclosure Acts then, it took the world away from human beings. People used to live freely. They didn't pay rent. Okay? You lived out there. You built your own whatever, a shack or a house, or a small castle for your people. You didn't pay rent. You didn't pay mortgage. You didn't have to have a bank loan and then work full time for 15 or 20 years to pay for your place. Okay? You're talking about a massive change in society. And that is what Polanyi said was the great transformation. That people were then enslaved, okay? Of course capitalism tries to make it the mythology of freedom. I said in an earlier session, they don't give a damn about your freedom. You are not free. You are a slave. You are forced to take their job with whatever garbage wages they offer because you have to be able to live. That's after capitalism. Before capitalism, you and me and a bunch of people could go live on the outskirts and farm and raise our own food and build our own places. Okay? We wouldn't be slaves. And that's why, actually, I read a very interesting article that, some anthropologists studied, and they said that human beings, the peasants, the poorest of human beings, had much more leisure time, okay, back in, the so-called Dark Ages than people have today. That's how much of a slave you are. Okay, it's not just the 40 hours, but, the time it takes to go to work and time it takes to get back. And you can't stop. You can't take a break. Okay, and that's why the socialism and unions have had to fight to try to get minimum wages, to try to get, time off, to get paid vacations, to get health care, and in the U.S. we can't even get that now, okay? It's because literally they took people's lives away, paying them, sub-poverty wages and working people to death. They even worked children to death. That's capitalism, guys. And if you give them their freedom, we will all be back in that. Okay? It took a lot of fighting. Literally, unions and socialists fighting in the streets of America against the police, against the military, against business owners to get these freedoms and benefits, okay? If you give it up, you're going to be very sorry, okay? The next, let me see how, 14 minutes in, so I think I'm going to chop this off right here, and I'm going to come back to, another reality that the Enclosure Acts produced, okay? And this is critical to understanding capitalism. It's critical to understanding why you're a slave and you can't get out of it, okay? So come back. Assalamu alaikum.